I'm going to be honest for a second. I consider myself an agnostic. And one of the biggest reasons that I consider myself an agnostic is because I find that there is a very big confliction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Not exactly in doctrine or in words, but in the personality of God, in a way. And I mean, in the Old Testament, it seems that, you needed to sacrifice this, and they needed to go and conquer and kill these people. And, the Jews were the only people that God considered as his children and loved. The Gentiles, they weren't loved by God unless they were accepted into the Jewish faith. Whereas with Christianity, I mean, you lose a lot of, I guess, the harshness of God that you would see in the Old Testament. And a lot of people say, well, that's God changing the way he interacts with people. But the way that I see it is that the Old Testament versus the New Testament, it seems like an entirely different God. In the same way that a lot of people say the differences between Christianity and Mormonism, you see two different gods. I see that with Judaism and Christianity. The Old Testament and New Testament, they're like two completely separate entities. And God, who says, I am what I am, I can't see him changing that drastically within such a short period of time.
All right. It's a difficult issue, and it's not as clear as I wish it was. But the Jews were not the only people God loved. In the Old Testament, you go right back to Genesis 1 and 2. God loves all people. God respects all people because all human beings are created in his image. Well, then what's the fixation all about on the Jews? Simply this. God, right as soon as the fall occurred, said, I am going to provide a redeemer. And I'm going to bring this redeemer into the world through a particular line, the line of Abraham. It does not mean that Abraham is superior to Hagar or Ishmael or the Arab people. Not at all. It simply means that when God is going to provide redemption, salvation, he's going to do it by bringing Messiah into the human history, and he's going to do it through the Jewish people. So when the Old Testament says the Jews are the chosen people, it does not mean that the Jews are God's pets. Oh, no, Cliff, you're wrong. Fine. Then look what happens to the Jews after God uses them to judge the Canaanites. God uses first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians to judge the Jews for their evil. Daniel. Remember Daniel? All right. Daniel is in exile. Daniel has been ripped out of his home. He's been ripped out of his country, and he is in exile in Babylon.
So God uses the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all these things to do his work, to punish the Jewish people. But God himself still calls those people evil. They're the oppressing, they oppress his children, his chosen people. And for doing that, they in turn are punished by God as well. The Assyrians and Babylonians, they're tools used by God to punish the Jews, but they're still punishing his chosen people, and he recognizes that. And I don't know, it just seems...
Okay. Do you really think over the past 3,000 years, the Jewish people have had it easy?
Oh, no. Not at all.
Some of the most persecuted people on the face of the planet, right? So you see, the Bible is not saying that God has pets, and those pets are Jews. Rather, it's simply saying that when God wanted to reveal himself most clearly, he became a man, and he was a Jew. That's all it means. It doesn't mean all Jews go to heaven. It doesn't mean all Jews go to hell. We're all individuals. We have to make our own decision about how to respond to God, how to respond to Christ. That's all it means.
Well, and that's kind of what I mean, but I see a stark difference in the attitude. I mean, you say, you give the example of today, the Jewish people are not seemingly the most loved by God in any way. They're horribly persecuted, and that's completely true. But, and it just, in the Old Testament, it feels they were the chosen people. They were the loved ones. They were the people that were destined to bring salvation to the entire world. And at this point, it just seems like not God has forsaken him, but it's like he's got a different mind. And it feels like there's an Old Testament God with one mind, and there's New Testament God with a different mind.
Okay, we'll get to that. But remember, sir, the biggest miracle in the Old Testament is God delivers the Jews from slavery. So no, the Jews are not this pet group of people that God sort of says, here's the easy street because you're superior to everybody else. No, Jews get knocked around in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and for the past 2,000 years. They're not God's pets. Simply meant the chosen people is God chose to become a human being, to be born a Jew, to come from the line of Abraham. That's all it means. All right, second point. Where is the bloodiest book in the Bible? Is it in the Old Testament or is it in the New Testament? Old Testament. It's the last book of the New Testament, book of Revelation. The blood flows in the book of Revelation like in no book in the Old Testament. It talks about the final day of judgment. It talks about the judgment of God of humanity. And it's ugly. So the Bible is horribly consistent. God is good. Part of his goodness is shown in his justice. He cannot allow evil to win. He punishes evil, and ultimately he will destroy evil in hell. But God is also forgiving and merciful. And those two come together at the cross. Once again, the cross of Christ is not a pretty sight. It's agony, pain, grotesque torture. But the point of Christ is, I am absorbing the penalty for human sin. I am dying as a sacrifice. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have the bloodiest book in the Bible, not in the Old Testament, but the last book of the New Testament. Secondly, one of the most eloquent expressions of God's love is in the Old Testament. It's the book of Hosea. Please read the thing. Hosea was a prophet of God who was married to a woman named Gomer. Eventually, when he's holding his second child, Hosea begins to realize, I am not the daddy of this child. And when he holds his third child with Gomer, he realizes, I am not the father of this child. And he says, divorce, divorce. She's an adulteress. And God says, no, Hosea, I want you to be faithful and committed to your wife who is an adulteress. It gets so bad, sir, that Gomer's lovers bring her down to the slave market to sell her to a man who will pay the highest price. Hosea goes down to the slave market, barters against other men to buy back his wife. God is teaching Hosea a lesson. God is saying, Hosea, do you know the pain that you experience over your wife's sexual unfaithfulness? Well, that is similar to the pain that I experience because human beings who I love, who I've been faithful to and committed to, have turned their backs on me and gone their own way. It is one of the most poignant, passionate expressions of God's love anywhere in the Bible. It's the book of Hosea in the Old Testament.
Can I say something else? Okay. I'd like to bring up the idea of the way that God treats certain things differently from Old to New Testament. Like, an example, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to mess this up. In the Old Testament, there is a verse that talks about if a man, molests a young lady or rapes a young lady, that it is his duty to pay a certain amount of money to the woman's father and then to marry her. And that is God's will for that situation. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we see that in the New Testament anywhere. And I can't imagine Christ, the persona of Christ that I have in my head, agreeing with that form of logic.
You're thinking correctly. I agree with you. But now we've got to study context. Now, in the New Testament, some of the context we're tipped off to by Jesus. The passage is in Matthew chapter 19. I'm going to read it to you to just let it sink in. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Okay, smooth so far. But here comes the heat. Why then, they asked, did Moses, okay, now they're going back to Leviticus. Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? I mean, come on, Jesus, just listen to what you just said to us. God created marriage to be till death parts us. Bravo, Jesus, we're all on the same page. But now, why in Leviticus does Moses say, men, if you're going to divorce your wives, give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. You are right. There are some weird laws in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they are not the ideal. The ideal is in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, before the fall. And what you have in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is you have God tightening the noose on a group of people, in this case the Jews, who were a theocracy. All the cultures around them had slavery off the charts, divorce off the charts, sex off the charts. And God is calling them to be different, but he's patient. And he's saying, okay, you're going to divorce your wife. Make sure you give her a certificate of divorce. Why? I divorce you today. Tomorrow, can you be my wife again? Day after tomorrow, I'm going to divorce you again. And they just played them in and out. And so Moses says, no, you're not going to play with people that way. You're going to write her a certificate of divorce, send her away, and you're not going to say, oh, by the way, we really are married. See, so it's really important to read the context of these things. And that especially is true of slavery. Obviously, white Christians in the United States have used some of the statements on slavery in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as well as some of the statements by Paul to justify slavery. That is not what is being done at all. Rather, the noose is being tightened on slavery in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Does that make any sense?
Yes. And I actually think I have to go here in a second. So
Thank you so much. Good to meet you.